do you want?
I want to stay here.
You can't stay here.
Yeah, but you're staying here.
I'm conducting.
Oh, you mean if you conduct, you can stay here?
That's right. Get out.
All right, I want to conduct.
You can't conduct.
In the final months of his life, Dean Martin, one of the most iconic entertainers to ever grace Hollywood, sat down for an interview that no one expected, and even fewer were emotionally prepared for. Known for his effortless charm, silky voice, and unshakable composure, Dean had spent decades hiding his deepest pains behind a relaxed smile and a perfectly timed joke. But in this rare, late-life conversation, the mask slipped. For the first time, he spoke openly about the losses he never recovered from, the regrets he carried quietly, and the truth about the loneliness that followed him even at the height of fame. As the cameras rolled, Dean reflected on his fractured relationships, the devastating death of his beloved son, and the private sorrow he had concealed from the public for years. His voice trembled at moments, cracking in ways his family had never heard. By the time the interview ended, those closest to him, including his children, were overwhelmed with emotion. The man who had once been the king of cool was suddenly vulnerable, raw, and heartbreakingly honest. What Dean revealed that day was not just a reflection of a career filled with glamour, but of a lifetime marked by a silent heartbreak. And for his family, hearing his truth, perhaps too late, left them in tears. In the final stretch of his life, Dean Martin had transformed from the charismatic entertainer who dominated television screens into a far quieter, more withdrawn version of himself. Friends and family often describe this period as the slow fade, a time when the spotlight no longer mattered and the laughter that once filled his world became softer, more distant. For decades, Dean had been a symbol of effortless cool, one of the rare stars whose charm seemed completely natural. But behind the scenes, age, loss, and a lifetime of emotional restraint began catching up to him. The man who could light up a room with a single line now preferred dim rooms, quiet evenings, and the familiar comfort of old memories. His decline wasn't sudden. It unfolded over years, beginning after the tragic death of his son, Dean Paul Martin. In 1987, that moment marked a turning point in Dean's life. He had known heartbreak before, but losing his son shattered something deep inside him. Those who visited him afterward noticed the shift instantly. His jokes became softer. His eyes carried a heaviness that no amount of showbiz polish could hide. He continued performing for a time, but the spark was dimmer, and the joy he once radiated felt forced, as if he were performing out of habit rather than passion. As he grew older, Dean slowly retreated from the public eye. He turned down interviews, declined offers to return to television, and stopped pursuing large projects. Instead, he spent long days inside his home, smoking, sipping quietly, and revisiting old memories. Friends would drop by, but even then, he was a man of fewer words. He wasn't lonely in the traditional sense. He had people around him, but he was emotionally detached, drifting deeper into a world of private thoughts. His children, realizing his emotional distance, visited when they could, hoping to bring him comfort. But Dean rarely opened up completely. Even in his quietest moments, he maintained the stoic exterior that had defined him for so long. Health complications also played a significant role in his withdrawal. The years of smoking and drinking caught up to him, and his once strong voice grew weaker. Walking became more difficult, and his energy faded. Doctors encouraged him to slow down, and he complied. Eventually, he accepted that his career, the decades of music, films, and television, was behind him. He didn't fight the change. He simply drifted with it as if he had always known this chapter would come. To those around him, it felt like Dean was preparing himself for a quiet exit from the world he had entertained for so long. But the emotional weight he carried was heavier than the physical decline. Dean was a man who rarely expressed deep feelings publicly, often deflecting with humor or charm. In private, however, he was deeply affected by the fractured relationships that had built up over the years. His personal life had been full of twists, multiple marriages, complicated romances, and the lingering tension that fame often creates within families. As he aged, unresolved regrets began surfacing. He thought about the moments he missed, the misunderstandings he never fixed, and the conversations he never had with his children. These emotions stayed bottled up for years, until the day he finally agreed to sit down for what would become the most vulnerable interview of his life. Those close to him knew he didn't agree to interviews lightly. So when he said yes to one in his final months, his family assumed he simply wanted to reflect on his legendary career. What they didn't expect was the emotional avalanche that followed, an outpouring of truth, love, loss, and regret that would leave them in tears. For the first time, Dean Martin seemed ready to let the world see the man behind the legend. Dean Martin finally agreed to sit down for what would become his last meaningful interview. No one, including the interviewer, expected the emotional depth he was prepared to reveal. Dean had always been a master of keeping things light. For decades, he perfected the art of saying just enough without ever exposing the raw emotions underneath. Fans adored him for his relaxed charm, but those closest to him knew this ability to hide behind humor was also his strongest shield. It protected him from discussing pain, responsibility, or vulnerability. That's why, on the day the cameras rolled, everyone expected more of the same. Soft jokes, fond memories, and gentle nostalgia. Instead, Dean opened a door he had spent a lifetime keeping locked. The interview began simply. He talked about his early career, the long nights in smoky clubs, and the joy of singing before he was anybody. His voice carried a rare warmth as he remembered those early days with genuine affection. But as the conversation shifted to his later life, the pressures of fame, the strains on his marriages, and the complicated relationship he had with his children, something in Dean changed. His normally easy smile faded, and for a moment he seemed unsure if he wanted to continue. Then, in a tone that surprised even himself, he began to speak honestly about the regrets that had haunted him for years. He admitted that he had not always been present, the way he wished he had been. Fame had taken him in so many directions, and with each new project, another piece of personal life slipped through the cracks. He spoke about long stretches away from home, missed birthdays, and the emotional distance that naturally formed when a parent is always in motion. He didn't blame his career. He blamed his choices. It was a rare moment of accountability from a man who had spent most of his life avoiding such discussions. But the most heartbreaking moment came when the interviewer gently asked about his son, Dean Paul Martin. The question hung in the air for a long time. Dean's eyes welled with tears, real, unhidden, and almost too painful to watch. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said losing his son shattered him in a way he could never fully recover from. He admitted that after the tragedy, a part of him simply stopped caring about the world. Performing felt empty. Applause felt hollow. Nothing filled the void. He didn't talk about the anguish publicly back then because he didn't know how. The only way he survived was by shutting down emotionally. And he now regretted that shutting down had distanced him from the people who loved him most. He confessed that he wished he had reached out more to his children and spoken with them about his grief instead of hiding it. He felt they deserved more than the stoic silence he gave them, but at the time, he wasn't capable of anything else. "I thought I was protecting them," he said. "But I think I was just protecting myself." It was perhaps the most vulnerable sentence Dean Martin ever spoke in his life. The interviewer, stunned by the raw honesty, allowed long pauses between questions. Dean needed time to collect himself, but he seemed determined to continue. He talked about love, how he had experienced it, lost it, and mishandled it. He acknowledged that his marriages didn't fail because of bad luck, but because he simply didn't know how to express emotion in a healthy way. He admitted he had relied too much on charm, assuming it could mend what real communication should have fixed. By the time the interview ended, those in the room felt they had witnessed a man taking emotional responsibility for the first time. It wasn't dramatic or sensational. It was quiet, gentle, and deeply human. And for his family, who later watched the footage, hearing Dean speak so openly was both heartbreaking and healing. It was the truth they had waited a lifetime to hear. When Dean Martin's family gathered privately to watch the full recording of his final interview, none of them were prepared for what they were about to hear. For years, they had lived beside a man who was both deeply loving and emotionally distant. He never lashed out, never raised his voice, never burdened anyone with his sorrows, but he also rarely opened up about what he truly felt. Love was shown through quiet gestures, not through conversations. Pain was buried, not shared. And while his children adored him, they also carried silent questions Dean had never answered in his lifetime. That changed the moment the interview began to play. At first, the footage felt familiar. Dean reminiscing about his early years, smiling that gentle smile, speaking with the same warmth fans recognized. But as the interview shifted into more vulnerable territory, the room fell silent. Each member of his family watched with a mixture of surprise, sadness, and disbelief. Some leaned forward. Others wiped their eyes quietly, not ready to break the moment. It was the first time they had heard Dean Martin, the legend, the entertainer, the father, speak with complete honesty about the emotional battles he had kept hidden. When he confessed that he regretted not being present enough during their childhoods, his children were struck deeply. They had always wondered if he understood the emotional distance that had formed over the years, or if he assumed everything was fine because no one talked about it. Hearing him acknowledge those regrets, especially so late in life, brought a wave of emotions they couldn't contain. It wasn't anger. It was grief. The grief of knowing he had carried guilt alone. The grief of realizing they had spent many years misunderstanding his silence. And the grief of recognizing that time had run out to truly reconcile those feelings with him in person. But the part that brought the entire room to tears was his raw confession about the death of his son, Dean Paul. For decades, the family had witnessed his withdrawal, but Dean had never spoken openly about the depth of his heartbreak. When he admitted that he simply shut down because he didn't know how to survive the pain, his children finally understood the root of the emotional distance that followed. It was never indifference. It was devastation. It was a father shattered beyond repair. Some of his children cried quietly as they heard him say he wished he had talked to them more, leaned on them, or allowed them into his grief. Others broke down openly, realizing that the walls he built weren't meant to keep them out, they were meant to keep himself from collapsing. His vulnerability in that moment felt like a message he had never been able to deliver face to face. I loved you. I needed you. I just didn't know how to say it. His ex-wife, who viewed the footage privately later, described the interview as the closest Dean ever came to an apology, not because he had been cruel, but because he had been emotionally unreachable at times when it mattered most. She admitted it was both painful and comforting to hear him finally articulate feelings that had remained unspoken throughout their marriage. For his family, the interview was more than a look into his past. It was a key that unlocked decades of confusion. Many of them had interpreted his emotional withdrawal as disinterest or detachment. They had spent years wondering why he never talked about his pain or why he avoided deep conversations. Seeing him finally express those feelings brought a sense of closure they didn't even realize they needed. When the video ended, the room stayed silent for several minutes. Some hugged, others quietly wiped their faces. No one spoke right away because there were no words big enough to match the weight of what they had just seen. But beneath the sadness, there was understanding, the kind that brings peace after years of misinterpretation. Dean Martin had always been known as the king of cool, a man who seemed untouched by sorrow or conflict. But in this final interview, he revealed the truth. He was human, he was hurting, and he carried more love and regret than anyone ever knew. And for his family, that truth was enough. It healed wounds, softened memories, and allowed them to finally see the father behind the legend. Dean Martin's final interview didn't just leave his family in tears. It left a lasting imprint on how the world remembers him. For decades, fans celebrated him as the suave, uncheckable entertainer who could charm any audience with ease. They remembered the laughter, the music, the effortless cool. Yet behind the fame and the perfectly timed jokes, Dean had lived a life of quiet struggles, personal loss, and emotional restraint. That interview revealed the complexity of a man who had been both a superstar and a deeply private father, husband, and friend. For those who witnessed it, it was a stark reminder that even legends carry burdens, invisible to the world. In the months following the release of the interview, stories about Dean Martin's vulnerability began circulating widely. Biographers, journalists, and fans alike recognized that they had never truly understood the man behind the persona. His honesty about grief, regret, and love added a depth to his legacy that went far beyond entertainment. Suddenly, Dean was more than a singer or actor. He was a human being who had loved deeply, suffered quietly, and in the end longed to be understood. For many, that revelation reshaped how they remembered his life and career. His family, in particular, took time to reflect on the emotional weight of his words. They shared stories privately about how his vulnerability helped them forgive past misunderstandings and reconnect with memories they had long buried. The tears that initially accompanied the interview transformed into a sense of closeness and reconciliation. Dean's children spoke later about how the interview allowed them to finally comprehend his love, not just through words but through the pain he had endured silently. They understood that the walls he built were not barriers to keep them out, but shields to protect himself from the unrelenting pressures of fame and loss. Even in the wider entertainment community, the interview had a profound effect. Fellow performers, colleagues, and fans revisiting his work realized that behind the relaxed, charismatic persona lay a man who had confronted profound loss and lived with it daily. His humor, charm, and talent had been mechanisms for survival, and his final confession offered a rare glimpse of the person beneath the legend. This candidness inspired many to reflect on the importance of expressing emotions, even when life seems glamorous or perfect from the outside. In the end, Dean Martin's final interview was not just a conversation, it was a masterclass in vulnerability and honesty. It reminded everyone that even those who seem invincible face struggles, regrets, and emotional pain. For his family, it provided closure, understanding, and a chance to finally see their father as he truly was. For the world, it enriched the legacy of a man whose impact on music, film, and culture is undeniable, showing that behind every icon is a deeply human story. Dean Martin may have left this world, but his final words continue to resonate, offering both heartbreak and solace, and leaving an indelible mark on all who experienced them.